My name is Renata Voss. I'm 32 years old. And the afternoon my father called to tell me my parents had used my promotion bonus to cover my brother's payroll was the day I finally understood that some people will call something a family decision after they've already made it. He said it the way he delivered all difficult information, quickly, in the first sentence, without preamble. We used your bonus. Your brother needed it more. He has employees depending on him, and you're single. You'll recover. My mother was on the extension. She said, "This is what family does, Renata. You'll understand when you have more responsibilities." I picked up a pen from the notepad beside my phone. I wrote down the number my father had said. I did not respond. I said, "All right," and I ended the call. What neither of them knew, what I had not mentioned to anyone in the family, was that the mortgage statement for the house they lived in would arrive in 31 days. The mortgage was in my name. It had been in my name for 2 years. And for 2 years, the payment had gone out of my account on the 14th of every month because that was the arrangement, and the arrangement had never once been written down. I set the pen on the notepad and looked at the number I had written. Then I went back to work. The house my parents live in is a 3-bedroom colonial on the east side of Milwaukee, in a neighborhood of post-war construction where the lots are narrow and the garages are detached and the streets are quiet enough on a Sunday morning that you can hear the neighbor's dog 3 houses down. My parents bought it in 2007, the year I started high school, and it was a stretch even then. My father was a machinist at a manufacturing plant that was already beginning the slow contraction that would eventually reduce his hours significantly, and my mother worked administrative reception at a dental group that paid modestly and reliably. The purchase made sense in the way that purchases made at the top of a market often do, on optimism about the trajectory rather than the current numbers. The 2008 correction was not kind to them. My father's hours were cut in 2009 and not fully restored until 2013, and the intervening years produced the kind of financial erosion that doesn't look catastrophic in any single month, but compounds into something significant over time. They didn't lose the house. They came close in 2011, and then my mother's hours increased, and they refinanced, and they made it through. But the experience left a mark on the household's relationship with financial stability, a specific kind of vigilance that expressed itself in my parents as a refusal to discuss money openly and a tendency to manage problems quietly and hope they resolved. I left for college in 2009, which meant I watched the worst of it from a distance. I came home for breaks and saw my parents in the particular posture of people who are managing something and don't want to be asked about it. I didn't ask. I had inherited, from both of them, the instinct to let difficult things be unspoken until they became unavoidable. I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison for a degree in Health Services Administration, which is the kind of degree that sounds bureaucratic and turns out to be the operational core of how medical institutions function. I graduated in 2013. The same year my father's hours were restored, which felt like a synchronicity I've never quite been able to assign meaning to, and I took an entry-level supply chain position at a regional hospital network called Lakeview Health Systems, in the procurement division. I was good at it in the specific way that people are good at things that align with the structure of how their mind works. I tracked complex inventories across multiple facilities. I managed vendor contracts. I identified inefficiencies in distribution that cost the system money, and I communicated all of it in the plain, quantified language that hospital administrators respond to. I was promoted 3 times in 7 years. The third promotion, to senior supply chain manager, came with a title change and a bonus of $18,500, which was the largest single check I had ever received, and which I had been anticipating since my performance review in January, when my director, a thorough and measured woman named Claudette Marsh, had told me the recommendation was going forward and that I should expect a decision by March. The bonus arrived in April. My father called 4 days later. My brother Dariush is 3 years older than me. He is, in the taxonomy of our family, the one who was supposed to build something, not because my parents loved him more exactly, but because he was the first and because he had, from an early age, the particular quality of visible ambition that parents recognize and tend toward without always meaning to. He talked about owning a business from the time he was in high school. He talked about it the way some people talk about a destination they're confident they'll reach if they just keep moving. The business he eventually built was a home renovation and contracting operation he launched in 2018 when he was 31, called Voss Homeworks. He had some construction experience. He'd worked for a residential builder for 5 years after a college career that had not produced a degree, and he had the social ease that is the essential quality for the client-facing side of contracting work. The first 2 years went reasonably well. He had 3 regular clients, a small crew of 4, and enough revenue to be paying himself a salary that, while modest, was real. The 3rd year did not go as well. A large project ran over budget significantly. A client dispute resulted in a delayed payment that became a partial payment that became a written-off balance. 2 crew members left for a larger operation, and Dariush replaced them with workers who were less experienced and required more oversight than he had time to provide. By the end of 2020, Voss Homeworks was technically operational but practically strained. The payroll was meeting its obligations, barely, and the operating account had a cushion that Dariush described to my father, in a conversation I was not part of, as enough for about 6 weeks. My father did not call me to ask. He called me to inform. What I had not told my parents, because the arrangement had evolved in the same way that all the arrangements in our family evolved through accretion, through small steps that each seemed reasonable and became permanent without discussion, was that covering the mortgage had not been something I had agreed to as a permanent structure. It had begun as a one-time thing. In March of 2021, my parents had called me to say that the mortgage payment that month was going to be short. My father's hours had been cut again during the initial disruption of the previous year, and they had burned through their cushion, and the shortfall was $1,240. I transferred $1,240 from my account that afternoon. The following month, my father called to say the situation hadn't fully resolved yet. I covered $1,240 again. By the 3rd month, something had shifted without being stated. My father no longer called to explain the situation. He called to confirm the transfer date. By the 5th month, he didn't call at all. He had added my phone number to the household's informal financial calendar, and the transfer was simply expected on the 14th, the way the water bill was expected on the 22nd. I had let it become expected because I could cover it, and because stopping felt like a disruption I didn't want to introduce. I had not sat down and asked myself whether an indefinite monthly commitment of $1,240 on top of my own rent and expenses was something I had chosen or something I had simply not declined. The distinction had not seemed urgent. By April of the year my bonus arrived, I had been covering that mortgage payment for 24 months. The total was $29,760. My name was the only name on the account because when the refinancing had happened in 2011, the mortgage had been restructured and my parents had, for reasons I did not fully understand until I asked to see the paperwork in 2022, ended up with a situation where the primary account holder was technically me. I had been added as a co-borrower during a brief period when my parents were trying to qualify for better terms, and then the structure had stayed that way through a subsequent modification. My parents knew my name was on the account. They had signed documents acknowledging it. I don't believe they had thought carefully about what that meant. When my father called 4 days after my bonus arrived, he was not calling to ask. He had already transferred $18,500 from my bonus account. I had made the mistake, early in the arrangement, of giving my father view access to a shared family account that was connected to my bonus deposit, which I had set up during the first month of the mortgage coverage to make the transfers easier, to Dariush's business operating account. The call was to let me know it had happened. I wrote down the number. I said all right. I hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table and looked at what I had written for a long time. I did not call my parents back that day or the day after. I went to work. I managed the distribution audit for the second quarter, which involved coordinating with 3 facility managers and 2 vendor representatives, including a particularly detailed reconciliation process with a medical supply vendor named Harford Procurement Services, whose regional account manager, a precise and responsive woman named Delia Cantu, had flagged a discrepancy in the prior quarter's delivery records that I needed to resolve before the audit closed. I resolved it on Wednesday. I submitted the audit summary to Claudette Marsh on Thursday. She replied within the hour. Clean work. Thank you. I had not decided anything during those days, exactly. What I had done was wait to see what I actually thought once the initial stillness of the phone call had passed. What I found at the end of the week was not rage. Nothing as clean as that. What I found was a kind of clarity about the structure of the situation, which was, my parents had taken something of mine without asking, had justified it with a framework in which my needs did not have standing, and then had characterized my having feelings about it as a failure of family loyalty. And the mortgage, the ongoing, monthly, unacknowledged mortgage, was sitting underneath all of it like a foundation that no one in the house had looked at the blueprint for. I called my mother on Saturday morning. I said, I'd like the bonus returned. She said, Renata? I said, it was my money. It was not a family account. I would like it returned. My mother said, your brother has people depending on him. I said, I know. She said, you don't have those responsibilities. You're in a position to help. I said, I wasn't asked. She said, we shouldn't have to ask. That's what family means. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, I want you to think about something. She said, what? I said, think about the mortgage. She was quiet. I said, think about whose name is on it and whose account the payment comes from and how long that's been true and whether anyone asked me if that was the permanent arrangement. Another silence. I said, I'll call you next week. I ended the call. I want to be precise about what I did and didn't do in the next 30 days, because the story is not about a dramatic confrontation. It is about a single, quiet structural change and what it revealed about the structure that had been there all along. I did not transfer the mortgage payment on the 14th. That was the entirety of it. I had set up the transfer as a manual process, which meant it required me to log in and initiate it. I did not log in. I did not initiate it. The payment did not go out. On the 15th, I received an automated notification from the mortgage servicer, a standard past due notice, sent to me as the account holder, informing me that the payment had not been received and that a late fee of $62 would be assessed if payment was not received within the grace period. I filed the notification in a folder I had created on my desktop called Mortgage Documentation. On the 17th, my father called. He said, the mortgage didn't go through. I said, I know. He said, there must have been a problem with the transfer. I said, there wasn't a problem. I didn't send it. A pause. He said, what do you mean you didn't send it? I said, I mean I didn't initiate the transfer. The payment didn't go out because I chose not to send it. My father said, Renata, the payment is due. I said, I know when it's due. I've known when it's due. For 24 months. He said, this isn't the time to. I said, Dad, I've been covering that mortgage since March of 2021. I've never missed a payment. I've never been late. I've paid $29,760 over 24 months, and no one has ever once asked me whether that was an arrangement I'd agreed to permanently. And then you took $18,500 of my money without asking and told me I should understand, because family comes first. I said this without raising my voice. I said it the way I give a quarterly report, in sequence, with specific numbers, without editorializing. So, I'd like you to tell me, whose name is on that mortgage account? He was quiet. I said, mine. My name is on that account. Which means the payment is my legal obligation, and I have chosen not to make it this month. If you'd like to make it from a different account, the servicer's payment information is on the statement. I'll forward you the contact number. My father said, you're going to let the house go into default over a... I said, I'm not doing anything to the house. I'm telling you that the payment I've been making voluntarily for 2 years is not being made this month. What happens next depends on what you decide to do. He hung up. My mother called 2 hours later. Then Dariush called. I let both calls go to voicemail. I listened to the voicemails that evening. My mother's was 15 minutes and covered several different arguments in sequence, moving from hurt to appeal to accusation and back. Dariush's was 4 minutes and was calmer than I expected. He said he thought what had happened with the bonus was wrong and that he hadn't known our parents planned to use it, which I set aside to evaluate later for its accuracy. I called my mother back the following evening. She said, this is not who we raised you to be. I said, Tell me whose name is on the mortgage account. She said, That's not the point. I said, It's exactly the point. My name is on that account. I've been making that payment for 2 years. No one asked me to commit to that permanently. And when I had $18,500, money I earned in my name from my job, it was taken without a conversation and given somewhere else. I'm not willing to pretend those two things aren't connected. My mother said, Your brother is struggling. I said, I know. I'm not asking him to return anything. I'm asking you and Dad to return what's mine. She said, We don't have it. I said, I know you don't. That's the situation. She said, So what do you want? I said, I want a real conversation about the mortgage. Not about this month's payment, about what the arrangement actually is, what it has been, and what it's going to be going forward. In writing. I want us to sit down with someone who can help us put it on paper. My mother said, You want a contract with your own parents. I said, I want an agreement I can read. That's not the same thing as not trusting you. It's the same thing as having trusted you for 2 years without one and ending up in this conversation. Silence. She said, Give us until the weekend. I said, The grace period on the payment runs out Thursday. If you want to make the payment this month, you have until Thursday. She said, And if we don't? I said, Then we'll deal with what comes next. My parents made the payment on Wednesday. My father transferred it from their own savings account, which I had not known still contained enough to cover a mortgage payment, but apparently did. My mother called Thursday morning to tell me it had been sent. I confirmed it on the servicer's portal and said thank you. She said, We need to talk about this properly. I said, Yes, we do. The conversation that followed, the real one, the one about the structure, happened over 3 weeks, across 2 in-person meetings at my parents' house, and 1 call that included Dariush, who participated with the kind of straightforward accountability that made me revise my assessment of his voicemail slightly upward. The mediating presence was a family financial counselor named George Stanek at a nonprofit financial advisory service in Milwaukee called Community Financial Guidance, who had been referred to us by a mutual connection of my mother's from her church. George Stanek was a patient, methodical man who had clearly sat in rooms with families in the middle of these conversations before and had the specific skill of translating loaded statements into structural questions. He asked my parents in the first meeting to describe the mortgage arrangement from their perspective. My father said, Renata helps with the mortgage. George said, How long has that arrangement been in place? My father said, About 2 years. George said, Is there a written agreement? My father said, It's a family arrangement. George said, I understand. I'm asking whether anything is in writing. My mother said, No. George said, And the bonus, can you describe what happened there? My father went through it. George listened. He did not editorialize. At the end, he said, I want to make sure I understand. Money from Renata's account was transferred to Dariush's business account without Renata's prior consent. My father said, We had access. George said, Access and consent are different things. I want to make sure we're clear about that before we talk about what the path forward looks like. My father's hands, which had been on the table in front of him, went flat and still. The outcome of those 3 weeks was a written agreement drafted by a paralegal at a legal document preparation service George Stanek recommended, a firm called Clarity Document Services, where a woman named Irene Bautista handled the drafting. The agreement specified a fixed monthly mortgage contribution from me of $620 per month, beginning the following month, lasting through December of the following year, at which point the arrangement would be reviewed. The remainder of the mortgage payment would be the responsibility of my parents from their own funds. The agreement included a clause stating that any transfer from an account in my name required my written authorization, and that the shared family account view access my father had held was revoked as of the date of signing. My parents signed it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. Dariush was not party to the agreement, but was present, at my request, as a witness. He signed the witness line without comment. The $18,500 was not returned in full. What was agreed, separately, and without George Stanek's involvement, was that Dariush would repay $9,500 of it over 18 months as Voss homework stabilized, not from obligation, as my parents saw it, but as a gesture he offered on his own in the call that included him in the family discussions. I did not ask for it. When he offered it, I said I would accept it, and I noted the offer in an email to myself that evening, so I had a record. By the time the signed agreement was in my file and the revised transfer schedule was in place, the shape of the household's financial structure had changed from something invisible and assumed to something documented and bounded. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was a piece of paper with 4 signatures on it. But a piece of paper with 4 signatures is a different object than a verbal understanding that no one has examined, and the difference between those two things is the difference between an obligation you agreed to and one you simply failed to decline. The months after the agreement settled into a rhythm that was different from what had come before in a way that was hard to name precisely, but easy to feel. My parents still called on weekends. Sunday dinners resumed in September. My father asked about my work with the specificity he reserved for things he was making an effort to understand, which meant he asked about the Lakeview supply chain audit and what the second quarter numbers had shown, and I told him, and he listened in the way he listened when something was new information that he was adding to a model he hadn't previously been building. Dariush made 4 repayments over the first 6 months, each on the date he'd indicated in the informal exchange, each transferred to the account I had specified, each confirmed by a text message from him that said only the amount and the word sent. I replied each time with confirmed. That was the extent of our communication on the subject, which suited both of us. Voss Homeworks did not collapse. By November, Dariush had rebuilt the crew to 5 people and closed 2 new contracts with a residential developer he'd connected with through a referral from one of his original clients. He called me in December, not about money, just to talk, and mentioned the new contracts, and asked what I was working on. I told him about a vendor consolidation project at Lakeview that Claudette Marsh had put me on, one that involved renegotiating 3 supply agreements simultaneously, which was the most complex thing I'd managed independently. He said it sounded like a lot of moving parts. I said, "It is, but I'm good at moving parts." He laughed. It was a real laugh. Not performed, not relieved. Just a laugh. Claudette Marsh called me into her office in February to tell me that the vendor consolidation project had been submitted to the hospital network's Operational Efficiency Committee as a case study in internal procurement restructuring. The committee chair, a physician administrator named Dr. Marcus Webb at the network's central office, had asked to meet with me the following week to discuss the methodology. The meeting was 40 minutes. At the end of it, Dr. Webb said he was going to recommend that the methodology be adopted as a standard protocol across all 3 hospital facilities in the network. I thanked him and walked back to my office. I sat at my desk and looked at the notepad on my left, the same notepad I had been using when my father called in April the year before, though I'd replaced the pages many times since. There was nothing written on the current page. I thought about the number I'd written down the day my father called. $18,500. I thought about what it had cost to write it down and say nothing and hang up. Not the money. I had made my peace with the money, or as close to peace as you can make with something that was taken without consent and partially returned. I thought about the cost of the restraint itself. The choice to not argue in that moment. To wait. The waiting had been the work. The agreement was a piece of paper. The mortgage was a legal document. The vendor consolidation protocol was a methodology. All of them were just formalized versions of a decision someone had made to track a thing, to name it, to put it in writing, to make it visible so that it could be shared rather than assumed. That is what I had learned to do, in the household I grew up in, by watching what happened when things weren't written down. The agreement has been in place for 8 months. My monthly contribution has posted on schedule. My parents' portion has posted on schedule. The shared account view access has not been restored, and no one has asked for it to be. The mortgage is current. Dariush has made 7 of the 18 repayment installments. Voss Homeworks has a backlog of work through the spring. He texts me the payment amount and the word sent on the agreed date, and I reply confirmed, and that is our arrangement, which is simple and honest and requires nothing from either of us that the other doesn't know about in advance. My name is still on the mortgage. That is a fact that will take some time to change. The refinancing process is something my parents and I have discussed but have not yet initiated because the interest rate environment has made it a worse option than continuing the current structure with the written agreement in place. When the timing is right, we will refinance and my name will come off. Until then, the agreement is what I have, and the agreement is enough because it is in writing and it is signed and it tells the truth about what everyone has committed to. That is what I needed. Not a confrontation. Not a return of everything that was taken. A document that told the truth. Here is what I know about the structure of invisible arrangements. They persist because the person holding them up is willing to hold them, and they collapse the moment that person decides to be willing differently. The collapse is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is the absence of a single transfer on the 14th of a month. Sometimes it is a phone call that ends with a number written on a notepad. Sometimes it is a piece of paper with 4 signatures that makes a thing visible that had been treated as a given. The given is not a given until it's agreed to. Until then, it's just a thing that someone is doing that everyone else has decided to assume will continue. The thing you agree to in writing is a choice. The thing you do without being asked is a habit someone else has mistaken for a promise. Only one of those is a commitment, and only the person who made it gets to decide when it ends. 8 months since the agreement. The mortgage is current, the bonus repayment is 7 installments in, the vendor consolidation protocol is being adopted across 3 hospital facilities, and Claudette Marsh has asked me to lead the implementation team for the fall rollout. My parents and I have Sunday dinners most weeks. My father asks about the implementation. My mother brings coffee without being asked. If you have ever been the person whose financial support of a family was treated as automatic, if you have ever had something taken and been told that wanting it back was a character failure, I want to ask you something specific. Was there a number? Was there a moment when you looked at what the arrangement had actually cost you, in dollars and months, in choices you hadn't made, and decided to put it on paper instead of carrying it silently? And when you did, what happened in the room? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. Subscribe for a new story every week. And if this one belongs to someone you know, send it to them.